I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truth. This episode is based on publicly available records, historical reporting, and documented findings from law enforcement and archival sources. All analysis reflects those sources and is presented for informational and educational purposes only. No statements in this episode are intended to accuse, defame, or imply wrongdoing by any living individual or institution not formally charged or convicted in this case. This podcast does not claim access to sealed evidence, does not assert conclusions beyond the documented record, and does not represent any law enforcement agency, political organization, or employer. Listener discretion is advised due to the historical violence discussed. On a warm July night in 1970, one of Kansas City's most influential political figures walked out of his own neighborhood bar and never made it to his car. Leon Jordan was a police officer, a world-trained lawman, a state representative, and one of the key architects of modern Black political power in Kansas City. But he was also a man caught in the cross currents of a city changing faster than anyone could control. New alliances were forming, old arrangements were breaking apart, and Jordan was standing in the middle, respected by many, resented by others, and feared by a few who wanted the balance of power to stay exactly where it had always been. At 1:57 a.m., shotgun blasts shattered the front windows of the Green Duck Tavern. Jordan collapsed on the sidewalk, dying within minutes. The killers vanished into the night, and the investigation that followed, the leads, the suspects, the missteps, revealed a Kansas City most people never saw, and many weren't ready to acknowledge. This wasn't just a murder, it was a message. But what that message meant depends on who you ask. For decades, the case drifted through rumors, sealed records, political discomfort, and shifting stories. Police files pointed one direction, community whispers pointed another, and the truth, whatever it was, stayed buried beneath layers of power, fear, and silence. Today, we're walking back into that moment, into the Kansas City of 1970, a city divided, ambitious, volatile, and on the edge of something new. Into the life of a man whose influence was undeniable, whose enemies were real, and whose death left wounds that still haven't completely closed. No sensationalism, no assumptions about communities I don't belong to, just the documented facts, the verified history, and the people at the center of it, all of them complicated, flawed, and human. This is the assassination of Leon Jordan, and this is Deadly Truth. Before you can understand why Leon Jordan was killed, you have to understand the Kansas City he was navigating, because this city wasn't simple, it wasn't peaceful, and it absolutely wasn't stable. Kansas City in 1970 was a place caught between eras. On one side, the old machine still lingered, the long shadow of Pendergast-style politics, backroom deals, and neighborhood power brokers who'd learned to survive every administration change. Even after the machine officially fell, plenty of people still played by its rules. Influence didn't disappear, it just went underground. On the other side was a new political reality taking shape. Younger activists, new community organizations, shifting demographics, and a generation that didn't owe anything to the old guard. Leon Jordan was a bridge between these worlds, and bridges are often the first things to break when the weight becomes too much. Jordan had spent years building something unprecedented, a political structure where Black voters in Kansas City were no longer treated as background noise, but as a decisive force. He wasn't just a state representative. He was a strategist, a negotiator, someone who understood exactly how the city's power worked and how to shift it without blowing the entire system apart. But changing the political landscape meant stepping on toes, sometimes intentionally, sometimes because there was no way not to. Jordan had allies, absolutely. But he also had rivals, not villains, not caricatures. Just people with their own ambitions, their own networks, their own stakes in who controlled what block, what ward, what contracts, what votes. Kansas City politics has always been a web of personal loyalties, old grudges, and competing visions. In 1970, that web was stretched thin. Add to that a city dealing with rising crime, racial tension, police distrust, and neighborhoods struggling with uneven investment and uneven justice. Every institution was under pressure. Every shift in power felt seismic. Jordan wasn't naive. He knew what he was navigating. He'd been a police officer. He'd trained international forces in Liberia. He understood danger, and he understood how politics could turn violent long before the public ever heard the rumblings. In the months leading up to his murder, Jordan wasn't isolated or hiding. He was visible at the Capitol, at community meetings, at the Green Duck Tavern, shaping the political future of Kansas City in ways that made some people hopeful and others uneasy. And when someone becomes that influential in a city undergoing this much change, it creates pressure, real pressure, the kind that makes powerful men nervous, the kind that makes institutions shift uncomfortably, the kind that, in some eras, ends in gunfire. Jordan walked straight through that tension every day, and on July 15th, 1970, it finally caught up with him. Before Leon Jordan became a symbol, he was a man, and the truth is, he lived several lives before he ever stepped into Missouri politics. Each chapter gave him a different kind of influence, and each one earned him a different set of allies and enemies. Jordan was born into a household where public service wasn't abstract. It was the family business. His father, Lafayette Jordan, was one of the first Black police officers in Kansas City, a respected figure who understood both the opportunity and the danger of being a trailblazer in a city with rigid racial boundaries. Leon grew up watching how his father survived those pressures. He learned early how systems work, who has power, and how fragile that power can be. Jordan joined the Kansas City Police Department himself in the 1930s. He wasn't a desk guy. He was athletic, sharp, respected for how he carried himself in the field, but he also recognized that police work, especially then, was limited by race, politics, and the quiet agreements that shaped promotions. Jordan understood justice, but he also understood the ceiling above him, so he did something rare. He left. Jordan moved to Liberia to help train their national police force. That move changed him. He went from local officer to international figure. He navigated diplomacy, law enforcement, and politics on a global level. He gained authority, confidence, and the kind of worldly perspective few people from Kansas City, white or Black, had at that time. When he returned home, Jordan came back with more than experience. He came back with vision. And he found Kansas City poised for a political evolution that desperately needed someone like him. In 1961, Jordan co-founded Freedom, Inc., a political organization designed to unify and mobilize Black voters. It wasn't radical. It was strategic. Freedom, Inc. wasn't built on slogans. It was built on numbers, ward maps, turnout, and the mechanics of winning elections. For the first time, Black voters had coordinated political power, and that power changed who got elected in Kansas City. Jordan ran for state representative and won, not because he was flashy, not because he was divisive, but because he understood how to build coalitions across race, class, and political alliances, and he refused to be boxed in. He was respected, he was intimidating, he was blunt, he was effective, and like anyone who gains influence quickly and publicly, he was watched. Some admired him, some depended on him, and some resented how fast he shifted the political balance. Jordan wasn't perfect. He had a temper, he could be stubborn, he could be demanding. He wasn't the kind of man who smiled through discomfort or backed down from people used to having the final say. He stepped into rooms where he wasn't always welcomed and didn't flinch. That complexity matters because the people who are hardest to define are often the people who make others the most uneasy. By the summer of 1970, Jordan was at the height of his influence. He'd helped elect mayors. He'd shaped city council outcomes. He'd organized voters who were never supposed to be organized. He wasn't just part of Kansas City politics. He was rearranging it. And when someone rearranges power, somebody always loses something: visibility, money, influence, or control. Jordan understood that, but he didn't slow down. Which brings us to the night he was killed. The final hours of Leon Jordan's life weren't dramatic. They were ordinary, and that's what makes the violence that followed so jarring. There were no warnings, no public arguments, no signs that this night was going to be anything different from the dozens before it. Jordan spent much of the evening at the Green Duck Tavern, the bar he co-owned with his wife Orchid. The Green Duck wasn't a political office, but it might as well have been. People came through constantly: neighborhood regulars, political allies, community organizers, off-duty workers, friends stopping by to talk business, gossip, strategy, or nothing at all. It was Jordan's territory, his comfort zone, and the place where he could be both a public figure and a man at ease. That night, he was relaxed. He talked with customers, checked in with staff, stepped outside occasionally for air. Witnesses described him as calm, even upbeat, no tension, no visible shadow hanging over him. Around closing time, just before 2 a.m., Jordan stepped out the front door, heading toward his car. This part is documented clearly. He didn't rush, didn't look over his shoulder, didn't act like someone who felt threatened. He was carrying the night's paperwork, preparing to lock up and head home. Across the street, 3 men had pulled up moments earlier in a car later identified as a stolen Oldsmobile. They sat quietly with the engine running. No one inside the tavern noticed anything unusual. At 1:57 a.m., as Jordan reached the sidewalk, the men got out. The shooter carried a sawed-off shotgun chosen for maximum spread at close range. Jordan never had a chance. The first blast tore through the tavern's glass, shattering the front windows. The second and third struck Jordan directly. He collapsed instantly, falling backward onto the concrete. Witnesses inside heard the explosions before they understood what they were. Several ran to the door and saw the gunmen fleeing. Not sprinting, not scrambling, but moving with the confidence of men who knew exactly how much time they needed. They climbed back into the Oldsmobile, pulled away from the curb, and vanished into the quiet streets. The entire attack lasted seconds. Police arrived quickly, too quickly for some observers, who later questioned how patrol cars appeared on scene almost immediately after the shooters fled. But response time didn't matter. Jordan was already gone. The shotgun wounds were catastrophic. Even with modern trauma care, he likely wouldn't have survived. Orchid Jordan arrived at the scene moments later and saw her husband's body on the sidewalk. That image, a respected state representative lying outside his own tavern, broken glass glittering in the streetlights, became one of the most painful and politicized photographs in Kansas City history. By sunrise, the city was buzzing, not with theories, not yet, but with shock. A sitting state legislator had been assassinated on the street. A man known for diplomacy, strategy, and public service had been executed like a mob target. And from the very beginning, it was clear that this was not a random killing. It was planned. It was timed. And whoever ordered it understood exactly who Leon Jordan was and what his death would disrupt. The question wasn't who pulled the trigger. The question was who benefited if Leon Jordan was gone. If the killing itself was clean and efficient, the investigation that followed was anything but. What should have been a high-priority, tightly run homicide case quickly turned into a maze. Part confusion, part politics, part pressure, and part silence. And every layer made it harder to separate fact from noise. From the outset, detectives agreed on one thing. This was not a heat-of-the-moment murder. It was a contract hit. The weapon, the timing, the coordinated escape, all of it pointed to planning, not impulse. But planning by who? That's where things got complicated. There were early leads. Witnesses reported seeing 3 men in the stolen Oldsmobile, but descriptions were inconsistent, partly because it was dark, partly because the attack happened fast, and mostly because no one expected gunmen to step out of a car at 2 a.m. and execute a state representative on Prospect Avenue. Police did recover the Oldsmobile. Inside, they found fingerprints, a jacket, and a few shotgun shells, all pieces that should have narrowed the case. But here's where the first cracks showed. Some of the physical evidence went missing, some was never tested, some was tested years later under reopened investigations long after it could have given clear answers. None of this points to one single conspiracy. It points to something more familiar in mid 20th century urban investigations: a lack of urgency, institutional discomfort, and a case bigger than the system knew how to handle. There is a working theory. Within days, detectives centered their attention on a small group of men with histories of intimidation, violence, and connections to organized criminal activity. These were not masterminds. These were the working class enforcers who got handed jobs rather than planned them. But here's the kicker: most of these men also had ties, loose, shifting, not uniform. Two, to factions of street level power operating in Kansas City at the time. That mattered because those factions were themselves entangled with business interests, political arrangements, and long standing neighborhood alliances. Jordan, in his rise, had disrupted some of those arrangements, not deliberately, not offensively, simply by changing who held political influence. And when someone changes the balance of power, someone else feels it. By the early 1970s, the police department was navigating its own tensions: public distrust, internal divisions, accusations of favoritism, and a city whose political lines were shifting fast. Investigating the murder of a man as polarizing and influential as Jordan meant stepping into every one of those crosscurrents. There were rumors, some grounded, some exaggerated, that certain detectives didn't push as hard as they could have. Others claimed they pushed too hard in the wrong direction. A few people insisted the department wanted the case solved quickly, just not solved thoroughly. But here's the truth, stripped of speculation: no one in power seemed eager to drag this case into the full light. Not because they hated Jordan, but because solving it would have forced the city to confront relationships, loyalties, and arrangements that had lived in the shadows for decades. Eventually, a suspect was charged, a man with a violent record and enough circumstantial connections to make him a plausible gunman. But the case fell apart. Witnesses recanted or contradicted themselves. Chain of custody issues surfaced. The prosecution couldn't prove who ordered the hit or why or whether the man on trial had even been at the scene. The charges were dropped, and the case went cold. For the next 40 years, the investigation lived in archives and footnotes, occasionally revisited, occasionally whispered about, but never fully resolved. Decades later, a cold case review uncovered what the original detectives could not or would not consolidate: a clearer picture of who likely carried out the shooting based on witness statements, forensic remnants, and the cross-referencing of long-ignored files. That review pointed strongly toward a trio of low-level enforcers who were active in Kansas City at the time and had loose connections to criminal groups with an interest in Jordan's political influence. But here's the tragic truth: all three were dead. Too late to question, too late to charge, too late to build a complete narrative. The case was officially resolved but never closed, because even if the shooters were identified, the larger question, who ordered it, never found a definitive answer. Not in 1970, not in 2010, not now. When Kansas City police reopened the case in 2010, they reviewed 40 years of files, witness statements, informant notes, and physical evidence. That review pointed to three men as the most likely participants in the hit. The first guy is James "Doc" Dearborn, a known enforcer tied to street-level criminal activity, had a record of intimidation and violence. Multiple witnesses placed him near the Green Duck that night. Several informants named him as one of the shooters. The second man was Eddie David Cox, and he was a career criminal and one of the few white members associated with the Black Mafia organization in KC. Extremely intelligent, known for planning logistics for criminal jobs. He later admitted, privately, not in court, to involvement in Jordan's murder, but denied pulling the trigger. He's still alive today, serving a federal sentence, but has never been charged in this case. Then there is James Raj Bolden, who was another violent offender active in KC at the time, was identified by informants but died before the case was reopened. So what the cold case detectives conclude? One, that the trigger man was likely James Doc Dearborn. The backup shooter or accomplice was likely James Raj Bolden. The planner/logistics coordinator was likely Eddie Cox. All three were dead except Cox, which is why the case could not be prosecuted. But then there is the question of who ordered it. This is the part no one could prove. The cold case team found no written orders, no recorded conversations, no surviving witnesses willing to name a mastermind. Detectives concluded the motive was tied to political power struggles, not personal grievance, but they did not name any political figure responsible. All this evidence I just went over is based on KCPD cold case files unsealed in 2010, public reporting from the Kansas City Star, statements from Detective Herb Robinson, and FBI and local records, all factual and not embellished because, honestly, there is nothing I dislike more than misinformation, so I try my best with these episodes to give the true facts. Leon Jordan's assassination didn't just take a life, it destabilized a system, and the effects were immediate. Jordan wasn't just a state representative, he was a strategist with a rare ability to pull different factions of Kansas City politics into alignment. When he died, there was no one with his exact reach, his relationships, or his ability to negotiate between old political structures and the emerging new ones. Within days, Freedom Inc., the organization he co-founded, felt the shock. Jordan had been its cornerstone, the person who could walk into the mayor's office in the morning, a ward meeting in the afternoon, and a community gathering at night without losing credibility in any circle. Without him, there was confusion, hesitation, and real fear about who might be targeted next. Kansas City's political landscape didn't collapse, but it shifted. Some alliances strengthened out of mutual protection, others fractured quietly, and the space Jordan left behind became a contested field. The 1970s were a volatile time for Kansas City. Rising crime, racial tension, debates over police trust, and neighborhoods that felt both unheard and unprotected. Jordan's murder became a symbol of all of it, the violence, the uncertainty, and the sense that the old rules had changed. People weren't just asking, who killed him? They were asking, what does this mean for us? What happens now? Who controls what comes next? And those questions made a lot of powerful people uncomfortable. Jordan's seat was eventually filled, Freedom Inc. reorganized, and the city kept moving forward. But nothing returned to the way it was. Jordan had been a political diplomat, someone who could navigate personalities, ambitions, and hidden pressures. After his murder, Kansas City politics grew sharper around the edges. Candidates campaigned differently. Elections shifted as communities rallied. The sense of vulnerability that leadership could be removed violently hung over the city for years. Even people who didn't align with Jordan politically admitted that his death created instability. He was a balancing force, and suddenly that balance was gone. Jordan's assassination exposed the fractures inside KCPD as well. The case raised hard questions about evidence handling, investigative priorities, and institutional trust, questions the department struggled to answer. And for decades, the case floated in a space between the unsaid and the unexamined. When the cold case review finally identified Dearborn, Bolden, and Cox as likely responsible, the public was left with a simple, unsettling truth. The city had lived with an unsolved political assassination for 40 years. Even with the killers identified, the full motive, the larger orchestration, never reached clarity. The city was left with pieces, not a complete picture. Despite the violence that ended his life, Leon Jordan's legacy didn't disappear. If anything, it grew. Freedom Inc. continued shaping elections for decades. His reforms influenced local policy and representation long after he was gone. His murder became a historical marker, a reminder of the price some people pay for shifting power in places where power resists being shifted. And in a quiet way, Jordan's assassination is one of those moments that tells you something fundamental about Kansas City. Progress is never simple. Power never moves without a fight, and some stories take a lifetime to understand. To understand what Leon Jordan's assassination really says about Kansas City, you have to zoom out. KC has seen mob hits, political clashes, and power struggles for over a century. But Jordan's case sits in a category almost by itself. Here's the truth. This was not a typical mob hit. This was not a random act of street violence. This was a political pressure point exploding. And when you line it up against KC's other high-profile killings, Binaggio, Gargata, Lazia, the Kansas City Massacre, a few things become painfully clear. KC's mob hits were usually about control of business or territory, and when mob bosses were killed in Kansas City, the motives were usually blunt. Territory disputes, gambling revenues, bootlegging wars, loyalty failures, and power realignments inside the Italian family. Johnny Lazia's assassination in 1934 reshaped the Italian faction. The killing of Binaggio and Gargata in 1950 reset the entire political influence structure. Those murders were brutal, but they made sense inside mob logic: money, territory, betrayal, the familiar currency of organized crime. Jordan's killing wasn't that. It targeted a state lawmaker, not a mob boss. It disrupted community political power, not organized crime territory. And it carried a message that wasn't meant for gangsters. It was meant for Kansas City itself. Mob hits usually came with clear beneficiaries. KC mob murders often revealed who gained power the minute the body hit the ground. The heir stepped up. The reorganizing began. The motive, even when unsolved, had a shape. Jordan's assassination left nothing tidy behind. There was no obvious successor, no immediate redistribution of political influence, no clear beneficiary who walked into a vacuum and declared dominance. That ambiguity is exactly why his case has haunted the city for decades. Jordan's assassination exposed how tight the lines were between politics, crime, and influence. Kansas City has always had overlapping systems: formal political power, informal neighborhood influence, organized criminal networks, old guard relationships, and community-led political mobilization. In most historical hits, those systems collided within their own circles. Jordan's death showed something more dangerous: that political influence, community power, and criminal operations were closer to each other than most residents ever realized. Not blended, not unified, just close enough that destabilizing one affected the others. He was killed at a moment when KC's political balance was moving. And some people, whoever they were, didn't want the shift to continue. Jordan's murder had a chilling effect, something KC's mob hits rarely triggered. Most mob killings didn't scare the general public, they scared mobsters. Jordan's assassination was different. This was a sitting representative, a respected public figure, killed on the street outside his own business. People wondered, if he isn't safe, who is? How deep does the influence run? What else is happening behind the scenes? The psychological impact on the city was heavier than almost any mob hit, because this wasn't criminals killing criminals. It was violence against democracy in a neighborhood where people believed their voices were finally being heard. Regionally, Jordan's case has no exact parallel. Compare it to the KC Massacre, a gang rescue gone nuclear, Johnny Lazia, an internal mob political rebalancing. The two Charlies hit in 1950, the violent end of mob political kingmakers. Then there is the St. Louis mob wars. That was business and territory disputes. Look at the Chicago outfit hits. This was power consolidation. Lastly, take a look at the Omaha and KC border killings. That was organized crime rivalries. Jordan's murder stands apart. He wasn't a gangster. He wasn't a political boss controlling illegal revenue. He wasn't an informant. He wasn't involved in organized crime. He was a democratically elected official who represented a community undergoing transformation, and he was taken out in a moment that stalled that momentum. Regionally, that's extremely rare. It's closer to a political assassination than a mob execution, even if the shooters came from criminal circles. The real revelation is Casey's power structure was more fragile than it looked. This is the part no one said out loud at the time. Leon Jordan's murder showed that Kansas City's political evolution wasn't guaranteed. Progress could be interrupted, influence could be punished, and a single act of violence could shake institutions far beyond one neighborhood or ward. When you compare it to other deaths in KC's criminal history, Jordan's assassination reveals a city caught between old power and new power, and willing, at least in that moment, to let violence redraw the lines. When people hear the phrase mob hit, they picture a very specific kind of murder. A mob boss taken out by rivals, or an informant silenced before trial. Leon Jordan wasn't any of those things. He wasn't part of organized crime, he wasn't running rackets, and he wasn't involved in backroom criminal deals. So why is his assassination consistently described by detectives, journalists, and historians as a mob-style hit? Because of how it was done, who carried it out, and what the killing reveals about Kansas City's power landscape at the time. Jordan's murder wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't messy. It wasn't fueled by emotion. It was planned, coordinated, and executed with the efficiency of professional violence. The kind of violence KC had already seen for decades in organized crime cases. The gunmen didn't argue with him. They didn't demand anything. They didn't search him or rob him. They stepped out of a stolen car, pulled the trigger, and vanished. A textbook tactic used by KC's criminal networks from the 1930s onward. And the men later identified by the Cold Case Review weren't political henchmen or panicked amateurs. They were career criminals who took jobs other people didn't want to be associated with. In Kansas City, that combination, professional shooters plus deliberate planning plus political implications, has always fallen under one category: organized crime methods applied to a target outside the underworld. Calling it a mob hit doesn't mean Jordan was tangled up in the mob. It means the killing bore the unmistakable structure of a paid, organized execution. A job handled by people who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly how to make it look quick, final, and unrecoverable. In other words, the label isn't about who Jordan was. It's about how the killers operated and what that operation says about Kansas City's darker, quieter networks of influence in 1970. Before we close this story, we have to return to the person at the center of it, not the investigation, not the theories, not the politics, but the man whose life was taken. Leon Jordan wasn't a symbol when he was alive. He became that later. In life, he was simply a man trying to build something better than what he'd been handed. He was a son who watched his father break racial barriers inside a police department not built for him. He was a husband who built a business with his wife, Orchid, a place meant to be a safe gathering spot in a neighborhood that didn't always feel safe. He was a police officer who left the country to help train law enforcement in Liberia, proving that his experience and leadership weren't limited by geography or race. He was a representative who believed that civic power shouldn't belong to one group forever just because it always had. He was a strategist who believed in the math of democracy, that if people are organized, they can be heard. And he was a man who walked into every room, whether it was the Capitol, a local ward meeting, or the Green Duck Tavern, with the posture of someone who knew exactly who he was. Jordan was not perfect. No one in public life ever is, but he was committed. He was steady. He believed that progress didn't come from shouting. It came from showing up every day, even when the work was uncomfortable, even when the stakes were high, even when people around him disagreed. His death was violent, senseless, and undeserved. But his life was none of those things. He shaped elections. He shaped policy. He shaped conversations Kansas City had been avoiding for generations. And he did it not as a kingmaker or a power broker, but as a man who believed that his community deserved representation that actually represented them. The tragedy of his assassination isn't just that he was taken. It's that Kansas City lost someone who was actively building a future in which power wasn't supposed to be hoarded or inherited, it was supposed to be earned. Jordan's legacy is not in the crime scene photos. It's in the generations of public servants, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who vote, organize, and speak out because of the structures he helped create. His story reminds us that progress is fragile, leadership is vulnerable, and the people who fight hardest to expand democracy are often the ones who pay the highest price. Today, we speak his name not as a headline, but as a human being who deserved more time, more years, and more recognition than he ever received. This episode is dedicated to Leon Mercer Jordan, a leader, a pioneer, and a man whose impact outlived the violence that tried to silence him. You've been listening to Deadly Truths with Becca. Leon Jordan's story isn't just a cold case. It's a reminder of how fragile progress can be and how dangerous it is when power is threatened in the shadows. His life shaped a city, his death exposed it, and the unanswered questions left behind still echo through Kansas City politics today. If this episode meant something to you, if you want more history that cuts beneath the surface, follow, rate, and share the show on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. It helps keep these stories visible and it keeps the work alive. Research and narration is always done by me. Sources for this episode include archival Kansas City Star reporting, KCPD cold case files, historical documents from Freedom, Inc., and interviews from the 2010 case review. And remember, the past isn't dead. It's just being forged in the murder factory.